Somewhere in Nagoya, in the autumn of 1945, a factory that had built the most feared fighter plane in the Pacific sat completely silent. No engines turning, no rivet guns firing, no smoke rising from the stacks. Just rows of half-finished airframes gathering dust in a building that, weeks earlier, had been one of the most heavily guarded industrial sites on the planet. The machine built here had ruled the skies over Pearl Harbor, over the Coral Sea, over Midway. And now the men who built it were being told, officially, permanently, that they were never allowed to build an airplane again. Not one. Not ever. What happened inside those factories in the months after Japan's surrender is a story almost nobody outside Japan has ever heard. It involves scooters. It involves sewing machines. It involves a superpower erasing an entire industry from a nation overnight. And it ends somewhere you would never expect. You know the Zero. Officially the Mitsubishi A6M, it was the aircraft that convinced the United States Navy, in the opening months of the Pacific War, that Japan possessed something no one in the West had anticipated. Light, astonishingly maneuverable, capable of ranges that seemed to defy the laws of fuel and physics, the Zero swept American and British fighters out of the sky for the better part of a year. It was designed by Jiro Horikoshi, a young engineer who had studied aircraft design in Europe, and returned home determined to build something that could outturn anything the Allies could put in the air. He succeeded almost too well. The Zero traded armor and self-sealing fuel tanks for weight savings, a decision that would eventually cost Japan dearly as American pilots learned its weaknesses. But in late 1941, and through most of 1942, it was simply the best fighter in the Pacific theater. Two companies built it. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries manufactured the aircraft at its sprawling plant in Nagoya, a facility that by the middle of the war had become one of the largest aircraft production complexes in the Japanese Empire. And under license, the Nakajima Aircraft Company built Zeros at its Koizumi plant in Ota, north of Tokyo, a factory so productive that by the war's final years it was turning out more Zeros than Mitsubishi's original plant. Between the two companies, well over 10,000 Zeros rolled off Japanese assembly lines over the course of the war, an industrial achievement that most Americans, fixated on the plane's combat reputation, never stopped to consider. By 1944, both of those factories were targets. American B-29 superfortresses, flying from newly captured bases in the Mariana Islands, began systematically bombing Japan's aircraft industry, and Nagoya, home to Mitsubishi's main works, was hit again and again. The raids were devastating enough that Japan was forced to do something it had never seriously attempted before: disperse its aircraft production. Assembly lines were broken apart and moved into schools, warehouses, tunnels carved into hillsides, anywhere that might escape the bombers. Production slowed. Quality slipped. Skilled workers were pulled from factory floors and sent to dig air raid shelters instead of building fighters. The empire that had once produced the finest carrier fighter in the world was now struggling to keep any aircraft factory intact for more than a few months at a time. But even shattered and scattered, the factories kept running, because the war was not yet over, and Japan believed, right up until the final weeks, that it could keep building airplanes fast enough to matter. Some of the dispersed production sites were never even finished. Workers dug fighter assembly bays directly into mountainsides outside Nagoya, chasing the promise that solid rock could do what steel and concrete no longer could: shelter the aircraft from bombs falling from 30,000 feet. A handful of those tunnels never produced a single completed Zero before the war ended. They simply sat there, half-carved, full of tooling and half-built fuselage sections, monuments to an industry racing a clock it could not win. That belief would not survive the summer of 1945. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast to the Japanese public for the first time in history, announcing the nation's surrender. 2.5 weeks later, on September 2nd, Japanese officials signed the formal instrument of surrender aboard the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. The war was over, but for the men who had spent years building the machines of that war, the harder questions were only just beginning. What happens to an aircraft industry when the empire it served collapses overnight? What happens to the factories, the tooling, the blueprints, the thousands of engineers who had spent their entire careers designing fighter planes? Nobody in Japan had an answer, but somebody in Washington was about to give them one, and it was more absolute than almost anyone expected. Inside the Nagoya works, workers reportedly heard the emperor's surrender broadcast over factory loudspeakers, the same speakers that for years had called out air raid warnings and shift changes. Some accounts describe stunned silence on the factory floor. Others describe men quietly walking away from half-completed airframes, leaving tools exactly where they lay, as if the work might somehow resume the next morning. It never did. Within weeks, American occupation personnel began arriving at Japan's major aircraft plants to inventory what remained, and what they found were factories still holding the raw material of an air force that no longer had a war to fight. Engines on stands, propellers stacked against walls, canopies still wrapped in the protective paper that had shielded them from dust. The occupation of Japan began almost immediately, under the authority of General Douglas MacArthur and the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, an organization that would come to be known simply as SCAP. And among the very first directives SCAP issued was one that, on paper, looks almost unbelievable in its scope. Japan was banned from manufacturing, designing, testing, or even researching aircraft of any kind. Not fighters, not bombers, not trainers, not gliders. The order did not distinguish between military and civilian aviation, because in the eyes of the occupying powers there was no meaningful difference. Every aircraft engineer in Japan, every aluminum stamping press shaped for a wing spar, every wind tunnel, every drafting table covered in fuselage blueprints fell under the same sweeping prohibition. An entire national industry, built up over 4 decades and responsible for some of the most advanced fighter designs on Earth, was switched off like a light. Think about what that actually meant on the ground. At Mitsubishi's Nagoya works, engineers who had spent the war refining the Zero's aerodynamics were suddenly told their profession no longer legally existed in Japan. At Nakajima's Koizumi plant, workers who had built thousands of the aircraft that once terrorized the Pacific Fleet stood in factories full of jigs and tooling that were now, by occupation law, useless. Some of that tooling would be destroyed outright. Some of it would sit gathering rust for years. The men who had built the most feared fighter of the Pacific War were now legally forbidden from ever building an airplane again, and nobody could tell them for how long. And it was not only the factories inside Japan that faced this reckoning. Under the reparations program overseen by the Allied powers, entire categories of Japanese industrial machinery, including aircraft manufacturing equipment, were marked for removal and shipped overseas to nations that had suffered under Japanese occupation, among them China and the Philippines. Precision lathes and presses that had once shaped the ribs of a Zero's wing were crated up and sent abroad as a form of compensation for the war Japan had waged. Some of that machinery would sit in warehouses for years before ever being used again. The tools of Japan's aircraft industry, in other words, did not simply vanish. They were scattered across half of Asia, a slow-motion dismantling of an industrial power that had, just months earlier, seemed unstoppable. So what actually happened to the factories themselves? This is where the story stops being about airplanes and starts being about something far stranger, because these were not small operations. Mitsubishi and Nakajima had built industrial complexes covering enormous footprints, employing tens of thousands of workers, and the occupation authorities were not simply going to let all of that machinery, all of that labor, all of that engineering talent sit idle indefinitely. The Zaibatsu, Japan's massive pre-war industrial conglomerates, were themselves targeted for dissolution by SCAP, seen as one of the pillars that had made Japan's militarization possible in the first place. Mitsubishi, one of the largest zaibatsu in the country, was broken apart. Nakajima Aircraft Company was dissolved entirely and split into more than a dozen separate smaller companies, stripped of its name, its unified structure, and of course its right to build a single aircraft. But dissolution did not mean disappearance. The factories were still standing, the workers were still there, the aluminum stockpiles were still sitting in warehouses. And so, in one of the more remarkable pivots in industrial history, these companies simply built something else. Nakajima's successor company, renamed Fuji Sangyo, looked at its idle aircraft engineers, its surplus aviation-grade aluminum, and its now useless fighter plane factory, and decided to build motor scooters instead. The result was the Fuji Rabbit, a scooter designed using leftover aircraft fuel tanks reshaped into bodywork, built by men who had spent the war stamping out cowlings for Zero fighters. It became one of the most popular vehicles in post-war Japan, a two-wheeled symbol of a country rebuilding itself out of the wreckage of an empire, quite literally welded together from the scraps of its own air force. Mitsubishi followed a similar path. Its aircraft engineers, banned from touching an airplane, turned instead to buses, railway cars, sewing machines, and its own line of motor scooters, the Silver Pigeon, which became a common sight on Japanese streets through the 1950s. The precision engineering that had once gone into a fighter capable of turning inside anything the American Navy could put in the air was now going into consumer goods, into the machinery of a nation that had been told, in no uncertain terms, that its days of building warplanes were finished. And what about the Zeros themselves, the actual physical aircraft still sitting on airfields across Japan and its former territories when the surrender was signed? Thousands of them remained, some fully operational, some in various states of assembly on factory floors that had never finished the job. Occupation forces oversaw the systematic destruction of much of what remained. Aircraft were bulldozed. Aircraft were burned. Aircraft were pushed into the sea. It was disarmament on an industrial scale, the physical erasure of a fighting force's air arm, carried out not on a battlefield, but in scrapyards and on runways all across the home islands. Some of that aluminum, ironically, likely found its way into the very scooters and sewing machines the former aircraft companies were now producing, the Zero's own airframe recycled into the tools of a nation rebuilding itself for peace. Not every aircraft met that fate. Scattered across the islands of the Pacific, on airstrips the war had left behind on Rabaul, on Bougainville, on countless other outposts too remote to matter to anyone anymore, Zero'd sat where their pilots had abandoned them, sinking slowly into jungle undergrowth or coral sand. Decades later, recovery teams and collectors would trek into those same jungles and pull rusted, engine-seized airframes out of the earth, some so intact that restoration became possible, others little more than a skeleton of ribs and longerons. A handful of those recovered wrecks now sit fully restored and flying in museums and private collections around the world, the very same design once banned from a Japanese drafting table, kept alive instead by enthusiasts an ocean away who wanted to hear that engine run one more time. Here is the detail almost nobody talks about. The ban was not temporary in the loose, symbolic sense people often assume. It lasted for 7 years. From 1945 until the San Francisco Peace Treaty took effect in 1952 and restored Japanese sovereignty, there was no legal Japanese aircraft industry at all. An entire generation of the engineers who had designed some of the most advanced fighters of the Second World War spent the better part of a decade forbidden from practicing the very profession that had made them among the best in the world. Jiro Horikoshi, the man who designed the Zero itself, lived through those years working in fields that had nothing to do with aviation, his genius effectively quarantined by international treaty. When the ban was finally lifted in 1952, Japan's aircraft industry did not simply pick up where it left off. It restarted almost from zero. Mitsubishi, still split into separate successor companies at that point, would not build another combat aircraft under license until it began producing the American F-86 Sabre jet in the mid-1950s, a former enemy building an American design under an American flag, in the very same industrial tradition that had once produced the plane meant to shoot sabres like it out of the sky. It would take until 1958 for Japan to fly its first indigenously designed post-war aircraft, a humble trainer, nothing like the fighters of the Empire's golden age, but a first step nonetheless. The engineers who returned to aviation after 1952 were, in many cases, the very same men who had spent the ban years designing scooters and sewing machine components, their skills held in a strange kind of suspended animation for the better part of a decade, waiting for the moment they would legally be allowed to draw an airplane again. It is worth sitting with just how unusual that gap really was. No other defeated industrial power in the 20th century faced a prohibition quite like it. Germany's aircraft industry, though also dismantled after the war, was restricted rather than entirely erased, and West Germany would return to limited aviation work well before Japan did. Japan's ban was total, and it was enforced for 7 full years. An entire chapter of a nation's technical history simply paused, mid-sentence, while the rest of the industrialized world kept moving forward into the jet age without it. What almost nobody tells you is that some of the exact people who designed the Zero went on, decades later, to help build the cars, the trains, and the industrial machines that define modern Japan. The scooters, the sewing machines, the buses, the post-war consumer boom that would eventually make Japan an economic superpower, all of it ran, in part, through the hands of engineers who once built the most feared aircraft in the Pacific, and were then told to forget everything they knew. Fuji Sangyo, the company built from Nakajima's ashes, would eventually merge with several of its sister companies in 1953 to form a new organization. Fuji Heavy Industries, the maker of Subaru automobiles, a name recognized around the world today by people who have no idea that its roots trace directly back to fighter planes designed to sink American ships. There is a strange symmetry to how the story eventually closes. Mitsubishi's aircraft division, the same one banned in 1945, would go on decades later to build components for American-designed jets under license, and eventually to develop aircraft of its own again, including regional jets meant to compete on the world stage, a level of ambition that would have seemed impossible to imagine standing in that silent Nagoya factory in the fall of 1945. Fuji Heavy Industries, born from Nakajima's dissolution, spent decades building small, practical, reliable machines, first scooters, then automobiles, carrying forward an engineering philosophy that traced directly back to men who once had to make a fighter light enough to outturn anything in the sky. The precision, the obsession with weight and efficiency, the instinct to squeeze every possible advantage out of a design, all of it survived the ban, even when the aircraft themselves did not. And that is really the heart of what makes this story worth telling. Wars end, treaties get signed, industries get dismantled by decree, factories get emptied, and history moves on to the next chapter, usually without looking back at what became of the people left behind in the wreckage. But the skill inside those factories did not disappear the day the ban was announced. It went underground, not into a tunnel this time, but into scooters, into buses, into sewing machines, waiting patiently for 7 years until the law finally allowed it to surface again. In a strange way, that waiting period may be the most quietly remarkable part of the entire story. A national engineering culture choosing to survive by building almost anything except the one thing it was best at, simply because it had no other choice. So the next time you see the silhouette of a Zero in an old newsreel tearing through the sky above the Pacific, remember what happened afterward. Remember the silent factory floors in Nagoya. Remember the engineers building scooters out of leftover fuel tanks. Remember the 7-year gap where an entire nation was legally forbidden from building an airplane, and how, out of that erasure, some of the most recognizable brands in the post-war world quietly took shape. The story of the Zero does not end with the surrender. It ends in a scooter factory, in a sewing machine plant, in a name stitched into the badge of a car you might be driving right now. And that, more than any dogfight over the Pacific, might be the most remarkable flight this aircraft ever took. If you want to see where the rest of Japan's wartime industry ended up, the story only gets stranger from here. Subscribe so you don't miss it.